It's a great honor and pleasure that I can say a few words at the beginning of this memorial event to commemorate Karel Schwarzenberg, who is definitely one of the most important personalities connected with Czechoslovakia and then Czech Republic in the second half of 20th century. For us, it's also an opportunity to say that Europaeum, which is a consortium of real leading European universities, is very important for Charles University, and we are proud to be members, and we are also proud that we can be an active member with events like our today's meeting. Of course, Karel Schwarzenberg is a personality which can be seen from really very different perspectives, but let me say also a few personal remarks, because I had an opportunity to meet him on several occasions, and I think that one of the most important was at the beginning of 90s, when he was not only a chancellor to our first president after the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel, but he was also very active organizing events for young historians, discussing various themes from modern Czechoslovak and Czech history. And although we disagreed on several points, I always admire his views and his ability to listen to different arguments, and he was then also, of course, able to present it as a diplomat and politician. Second time I met him was when I had an opportunity to cooperate with Professor Petra dealing with the documents of the Czech Exile Center, which was housed by Karel Schwarzenberg. And these materials were very important to understand what was also the history of Czechoslovak exile movement during the 70s and 80s. And these documents are now available for historians, and we have to thank also Karel Schwarzenberg to be so wise to know that it's important for the future generation of historians to do so. Of course, it will be possible to mention other dimensions of Karel Schwarzenberg and his importance for Czech policy, but I think that for that reason we have this conference, and of course I don't want to spoil much of the precious time because we have an interesting speeches and presentations afterwards. But again, let me welcome you here at Charles University, and I'm also looking forward to hear more about such important personality of our recent history. So thank you for coming.
Vice-Rector, thank you very much indeed. Welcome everybody. We also have quite a number of people online, so I hope they can hear us clearly. I hope that they'll be able to submit some questions, possibly in the Q&A at the end of this session or Q&A at the end of the second session, and we'll be able to get those questions read out. As you know, there's a first period here when we're talking about Karel Schwarzenberg's life. We'll then have a short break, and then we'll move to a wider discussion of the role of democracy and authoritarianism, etc., in the second session. I'm Andrew Graham, that's obvious. I'm the chair of the trustees, that's of the Europaeum, that's also obvious. And in a way, the fact that we're here and talking about Karel Schwarzenberg is obvious because he was a trustee of the Europaeum. And the reason we're in Charles is obvious, because we're here and we've met here. I'll come back in a moment or two and say why I think the connections are a little bit deeper than what I've so far said. But just a few words about Karel Schwarzenberg. I didn't know him until 2012, when he first became a trustee of the Europaeum. The photograph that's on the screen absolutely captures him. You could probably see a fairly tough-minded but willing to be wicked person. And I was talking to another trustee of the Europaeum, the new Chancellor of Oxford University, Lord William Hague, who was the Foreign Minister of the UK in a period that overlapped with Karel Schwarzenberg, and I mentioned him, and he said, absolutely, he said. When I was going to meetings of the foreign ministers, he was one of the few people whom I would look forward to meeting, because he could be both serious and quick-witted and humorous. Quite a strong, I think quite driven person, but a very helpful person from the viewpoint of the Europaeum. I said that in one level, the reason why we're all here is obvious. We're commemorating Karel Schwarzenberg. He was a trustee of the Europaeum, and we're in Charles University. That bit's obvious. But I want to suggest to you, entirely in the spirit of Karel Schwarzenberg, why there's a much deeper reason. And some of you may have heard Andrew Graham say this before, because Andrew Graham's spoken at occasional times before, a couple of times at Charles, rather significant events. But if you haven't heard this, this is the way it goes. I want you to do something slightly surprising and just look out of the window. And maybe the people online can look out of their windows. Now, I don't know what you're seeing, and I don't know what the people online are seeing, but I'm willing to stake rather a large sum of money that what 99.9% of us saw was the buildings and not the glass. Just think what Europe was like before the invention of glass. Very cold, very dark, pretty horrible. What's the point? The point is we take it for granted. And we only have to look at what's happening in America now, and occasionally in bits of Europe, to see why we should absolutely not take democracy, the rule of law, and human rights for granted. And those were the things for which Karel Schwarzenberg stood up so strongly. I mentioned that I'd spoken in Charles University before. One was an occasion organized by the former rector, Thomas Zima, 2016. He gathered here the representatives of the Europaeum, Coimbra and Leru. And we collectively signed a declaration in favor of academic freedom. Very prescient move by the then rector, and very important, and absolutely where we all are now today. And so I'm personally rather moved to be back in Charles, very moved to be talking about Karel Schwarzenberg, and think it's very significant that we're doing it in his name, in trying to sustain the things which mean we can all sleep quietly at night and express our opinions without fear of disappearing. That's a slightly dark note, but that's what I wish you to ponder on, and I would now like to pass to the Vice-Rector, who will take it on, and then if there's do think about the questions you want to ask at the end of this part of the afternoon, and we'll try and take any questions that we can. Thank you all very much indeed, Vice-Rector.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, let me also say a few words of introduction. This time, maybe not on behalf of Charles University, as Vice-Rector Kuklík has already represented it here, but purely on a personal level. Almost 20 years ago, I worked as an interpreter and translator into French for the Lobkowitz family. It was quite wild and complicated time, full of restitution disputes that often pitted individual members of the same family against each other. I remember how in the midst of this messy legal battle, one representative of a related family emerged, with whom, strangely enough, all the opposing aristocratic factions communicated and recognized him as a kind of conciliatory, wise authority. And that man was Karel Schwarzenberg. He amazed me then with his strange ability to fall asleep in the middle of boring passages, only to wake up at the most important moment of the day and say something very pertinent. Later on, I was not surprised by other paradoxes. For example, that when this very decent, conservative representative of a noble family with a mapped genealogy since 1155, if I'm not mistaken, was running for president, he was portrayed by part of his campaign team as a punk with a pink mohawk on his head. Or the fact that in that same year, 2013, our female students from the Faculty of Arts had his likeness painted on their naked chests, and I could follow by many other paradoxes. I think that no one-day conference can cover such a distinctive phenomenon as Karel Schwarzenberg was and his influence on the shaping on today's Europe. Nevertheless, I was really delighted when the Europaeum approached me to cooperate on this event. If any of our politicians deserves to be discussed by several dozens of people from diverse European countries all afternoon, it is Karel Schwarzenberg. The French politician Édouard Herriot once said ironically, "Of all the vices, wisdom is still the most pleasant." I would therefore like to wish all of you present here and online to spend a pleasant afternoon with the humor and wisdom of Karel Schwarzenberg, and may our debates be so fruitful that the very subject of our research interest would not have fallen asleep if you had participated in them. Thank you for your attention.
I'll tell you a slightly relaxed story about Karel Schwarzenberg was not the only person with this ability to fall asleep in what would seem like serious meetings and then wake up. And I think it may be a quality of Middle European intellectuals. And Karel Schwarzenberg was most certainly a Middle European intellectual. My mentor was a Middle European intellectual called someone called Thomas Balog. And there was a particular international development seminar that used to take place in Oxford. And he would fall asleep quite regularly. And on one occasion, he looked as if he'd completely gone. And there was an American econometrician giving a paper about the smuggling into India. And my mentor, Thomas Ballard, was not at all keen on econometrics, which he regarded as economic tricks rather than econometrics. And at one point, he just woke up and he said, "What about the smuggling?" The American academic had never thought about the smuggling. Ballard said, "Shall we talk about something else?" So perhaps we should, unless anybody's in the pause, come to a question or two, either about, it's not a big topic, small topic. Europe, the future of democracy in Europe's troubled world. I'm sure some of you are troubled. Some of you think maybe democracy's got a few challenges. Maybe something curious about Karel. I'm just pause again and see whether I can't provoke you. Yes, very good. Speak loudly because it's helpful. There's the mic. Yep, good. And if you can indicate which speaker you would most like to hear from, that would be helpful. But it just put a general question.
Any of you. I was meaning to ask, so in my opinion, a democracy ends largely when the population think it's not working for them and they don't believe in it. What do you think is one of the key, what do you think is like the best way to convince a group of people who don't believe in democracy to believe in it again?
Just say that again a little more loudly, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm saying if a group of people don't believe in democracy, whether or not they should, if they don't, what do you think is the best way to make them believe in it?
I think I'll ask my colleagues to talk about that. But I think that the best way to enliven democracy, experience it. Supposing you're in a small community and you have to decide whether the particular area, which is not yet allocated to anything, could it be turned into a football pitch for the kids or games something or something, and then get people together, and then you take a vote on it. And then suddenly you realize that individually you can't do anything, but collectively you can. The point about democracy is that people act together, and you each think each person's vote looks absolutely useless, but added together, getting together with groups of other people, mobilizing. I think democracy is fundamentally, people have to get mobilized to change things that they want to change, and then realizing the impact that 100 people can have when one person can't. So give people the experience of bringing about change through democratic processes and democratic structures.
And I think that in Central Europe, I think it's a little bit easier because you can show people on the historical examples how the life was without democracy or with a limited democracy or under the people's democracy. So I think that it will be maybe a little bit easier than to attract them for democracy. But of course, it's not only showing historical examples.
I mean, there's that over-quoted remark by Winston Churchill, which is, democracy is a terrible system, it's just much better than anything else. And, most people these days are not old enough in this part of the world to have experienced the something else. But there are people around in your own societies who can tell you what it was like, and they didn't like it. And, I was hearing an American colleague the other day, and he said, we are now talking in America using a word that I never expected to hear used in America. Someone has disappeared. You don't want the knock on the door in the middle of the night. It's democracy that protects you and the rule of law that protects you against that. Anybody else stirred up? Ambassador.
I am not really sure whether we know how to educate people to be democratic. I know how not to educate them to be democratic. And you quoted Winston Churchill. I will quote Vladimir Lenin, who said, when you educate people about something, you can't treat them nicely. You have to beat them over their heads with it until they get the point. So that's exactly not the way to educate people to be democratic. The only way to do it, I have to confess, I don't much subscribe to the idea of lecturing people and explaining to people until they understand what it is to be democratic, but I do believe in the idea of leading by example. And the problem with democracy today in Europe is that so many of our leaders and politicians do not provide an ideal model for what we should be like. So we have to start from ourselves. We have to look at our flaws, at our insufficiencies, and try to be better Democrats, each one for himself, as Václav Havel would put it.
Ambassador, thank you very much. We've had those little Q&A. In fact, I think, Ambassador, it's now your turn to speak a little bit about Karel Schwarzenberg, if you
Is it this? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I very much appreciate and am honored by this opportunity to speak in this forum. Actually, it made me remember that I once accompanied Karel Schwarzenberg to the annual meeting of the Europaeum in the company of another late friend of ours, George Lord Weidenfeld, who was an important supporter of the Europaeum. So this is the right occasion. I would also like to add some clarity to the issue of falling asleep, which indeed was, one thing that Karel did for all the time I had known him, and in the most unlikely places and on the most unlikely occasions. In the early days after the Velvet Revolution, we accompanied Havel on his triumphant trips around the world and sat in the first row of auditoriums when Havel delivered one of his historical speeches, and Karel Schwarzenberg invariably fell asleep after the first sentence of the speech, and sometimes he even snored lightly. And then I discovered the most amazing thing. He was fast asleep, but he still clapped at the right moment. When Havel finished the paragraph, Karel clapped and continued to sleep. So I asked him, how this is amazing. How do you do that? And he said, well, in our family, we've known how to do that for 700 years. You cannot survive without it. So this was Karel, as those fortunate enough among us were allowed to address Karl, Johannes Nepomuk, Josef, Norbert, Friedrich, Antonius, Vratislav, Menas, the 12th Prince of Schwarzenberg, Count of Sulz, princely Landgrave in Kletgau, and Duke of Krumlau, was a European in more than one sense of the word. The unique story of his heritage, his life, and his legacy reads like a compendium in European history. First, for 700 years, the House of Schwarzenberg has been one of the most prominent European noble houses whose members held the rank of princes of the Holy Roman Empire and left a lasting impact on European politics, law, religious life, and military history. Many of the Schwarzenbergs were also known for their tolerant, all-embracing view of society and politics. One of the first barons of Schwarzenberg, Johann the Strong, was a jurist who laid the foundation of the code of evidence practiced under continental law. And although the Schwarzenbergs had been and always remained a Catholic family, Johann was at the same time sympathetic towards Reformation and a supporter and friend of Martin Luther. The Field Marshal, Count Adolf von Schwarzenberg, was the commander of the Habsburg armies credited with halting the advance of the Ottoman Turks in Central Europe at the Battle of Raab, today's Győr in Hungary. And to commemorate this victory, Emperor Rudolf II awarded him with a raven, in German Rabe, as the city, picking on the head of a Turk for his familiar coat of arms. Well, this became a bit of problem 400 years later, when we had to remove Karel's private cars with its doors decorated by the family coat of arms from the Prague castle courtyard ahead of a state visit by the Turkish president. Field Marshal Karl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg, was one of the most remarkable military leaders in the Napoleonic Wars who fought first on the Austrian side in the Battle of Wagram, which the Austrian lost against Napoleon, and subsequently he had to fight for Napoleon in the Battle of Gorodechno against the Russians, which he won. He then switched sides again and was in command of the Allied army that decisively defeated Napoleon in the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. For all that, Napoleon never stopped holding him in deep respect. As many other members of the family, he also made his mark as a diplomat, becoming ambassador to both St. Petersburg and Paris. Almost 200 years later, the French foreign minister at the time showed Václav Havel and his entourage around one of these palatial houses in Paris, which one housed the Austrian legation. And he was not careful enough because he asked, "Isn't that a spectacular place?" To which Karel Schwarzenberg retorted, "This is where my great-grandfather drank himself to death." His great-great-grandfather was the Austrian minister to Paris. One of Karel's favorite ancestors was the Landsknecht, Friedrich, Prince of Schwarzenberg, an adventurous 19th century soldier and author of several interesting works, of which the best known is the Wanderungen eines Landsknechtes, a book that Karel kept recommending to each of us to read. At the same time, his namesake, another Friedrich, Prince of Schwarzenberg, was a model Catholic cardinal, Archbishop of Salzburg and Archbishop of Prague. Karel's father, Karel VI, Prince of Schwarzenberg, outgrew his earlier conservative beliefs to become one of the leaders of anti-Nazi resistance among Czech nobility, as were his uncle Adolf Schwarzenberg and his adoptive father Heinrich, Prince of Schwarzenberg. Karel VI was one of the initiators and signatories of the Declaration of Loyalty of the Czech nobility in the face of the Nazi threat in 1938. But for the sake of time, you will forgive me for leaving out others, no less illustrious members of the family, but I think we get the picture. So, second, Karel bore witness to his Europeanness by his own life and its adventures. Although he always considered himself a proud bohemian and never tired of remembering the happy days of his childhood in the ancestral estates of Čimelice and Orlík, he spent the better half of his life in foreign exile after his family earned the distinction of giving name to a special piece of legislation, the so-called Lex Schwarzenberg, which stripped it of all of its holdings in Czechoslovakia during the ascendancy of the communist regime. He obtained Swiss citizenship, but for most of the Cold War had lived in Vienna, where he became involved in public life and politics on behalf of the Austrian People's Party. The Cold War dispersed his family all over Europe and also to North America and even Africa in Kenya. Thanks to his dynastical ties, he was also related by blood to most of the leading European royal and noble families. That provided him with an inexhaustible supply of family stories, similar to and at the same time completely unlike stories told in most families. When at the beginning of the 1990s, we accompanied Havel to one of the oldest royal courts in Europe to meet with the royal couple, Karel remarked of the Queen, "She was a most beautiful girl at the age of 16. Regrettably, her mother would never let us go out together unsupervised." This extensive knowledge of European and Middle Eastern politics and politicians was an invaluable visiting card for us in the early years following the Velvet Revolution in 1989. Kari introduced us to the history, the mores, the protocol, the etiquette, the cuisine, and the beverages of all the places we visited together. More than anyone else I have known, Karel Schwarzenberg was home anywhere in Europe and most of the world. At the end of the day, though, he preferred to stay in Prague, in Čimilice, or in Dřevíč, his little country house outside Prague, reading, smoking his pipe, taking walks in the woods, and indulging in fresh homemade bread, butter, and preserves and other simple delights of his childhood. Last, but certainly not least, Karel was a European by virtue of his enlightened, liberal, and informed world outlook and his deeply ingrained values of honor, public service, charitable activities, and an endless capacity for friendship and empathy. In exile, he dedicated his time and considerable amount of money to the support for human rights, co-founded with Vilém Prečan and supported the Czechoslovak Documentary Center of Independent Literature at his Bavarian castle of Scheinfeld, and in 1984 became the president of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights. In this capacity, he attended several political trials of Czechoslovak dissidents, which is also when we first met. His acts of kindness that helped many Czechoslovak opponents of the communist regime, writers and intellectuals, to survive through this difficult period of Czech and Slovak history were too numerous to list here. Following the Velvet Revolution, Kari immediately dropped everything he had been doing at the time and returned home, not to claim back his property, as the naysayers said, but to offer help in the spirit of his family code of service. He became first the chairman of the College of Consultants, an advisory body to the newly elected President Václav Havel. Havel's and our guide on the first memorable trips to Europe and beyond, and not long after that, the chief of staff, or as we say, the chancellor of the office of the president. Although he was a chancellor, no one who knew him would call him a Czech Bismarck. He was too kind for that. In the course of time, he entered Czech party politics, became the co-founder and the leader of a political party, entered the parliament as first senator and then a member of the parliament, and was appointed twice as a minister of foreign affairs. As much as he suffered through much of his party political life, he enjoyed the role of the foreign minister, in which he could use his extensive list of contacts and his vast knowledge of European history. He played a crucial, if informal, role in the early Czech-German talks that led to the Czech-German Declaration of 1997, the crowning moment of Czech-German reconciliation. And throughout, he remained a true European, always on the side of understanding, toleration, and overcoming of old prejudices, always supportive of European integration and the transatlantic bond, always suspicious of authoritarian impulses in politicians, be they Czech, Austrian, or Russian. In an interview, he did not hesitate to compare Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler and warn against his imperial ambitions long before the full-fledged Russian aggression against Ukraine. He was always ready to extend his support to human rights around the world. He was always ready to help a friend. The only thing he was truly intolerant of was political bullshit, as he called it in his always frank, though somewhat idiosyncratic and varnished vocabulary. He was, to end with, neither left nor right, neither progressive nor conservative, neither nationalistic nor cosmopolitan. He was simply European. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we now have a recorded piece from Professor Timothy Garton Ash. It looks as if it's about to run.
if anyone ever doubted that Central Europe exists, they should have met Karel Schwarzenberg. He was living proof of the reality of Central Europe. Of course, the scion of one of the greatest aristocratic families of Bohemia, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but then in his own entire life experience, part of the story of Central Europe. Like his great friend Václav Havel, he was a Bohemian in both senses of the word, a citizen of Bohemia. In fact, he often referred to it as Bohemia, particularly, I think, in German, but also a Bohemian in the English sense. His ancestors, the most famous of them, were great reactionaries in the first half of the 19th century. One reason they were so much admired by Henry Kissinger. And they tried to preserve the Habsburg Empire against the aspirations of the nationalities for independence and freedom. But Karel Schwarzenberg's family, very different story. After 1918, they decisively opted for the new Czechoslovak state of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. He grew up speaking Czech and German, and before the age of 11, Kari, as his friends called him, had experienced not one but two expropriations of the family estates by the Nazis and then by the communists. And so, as he himself said, politics came to him, so he came to politics. Interestingly, his first engagement in politics as a young man was actually in Austrian politics, quite quietly. I got to know him first through our joint engagement in supporting dissidents in Central Europe, particularly Charter 77 and Václav Havel. We actually met first in Budapest at an event, a parallel Helsinki Forum. So parallel and alternative to one of the official Helsinki forums, 1985. We were driven out of the official venue and up into a small mansard flat. And Kari, who was, of course, an enormous man, decided with somewhat aristocratic disdain that he was tired and a little bored, and so he laid down completely flat on the floor of this apartment, taking up quite a lot of space. That was my first encounter with him. But for all this aristocratic disdain, he was, of course, deeply engaged in the subject matter as president of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights. We worked together through the late 1980s on things like the Center for the Documentation of the Czechoslovak independent culture and opposition, which he gave a home to. I remember when we went on an unofficial mission at the invitation of Václav Havel to mark, not celebrate, but mark 20 years of the Soviet invasion of 1968. He suggested that as a symbolic act, we should go and pay our respects to the statue of Jan Nepomuk on the Charles Bridge. Of course, he was too modest to mention that Jan Nepomuk were two of his many names. And then, of course, in the Velvet Revolution, when he came back, we were together then and became the chancellor of the new president, one of the principal advisors of Václav Havel, and then a major figure in Czech and European politics twice, foreign minister, senator, candidate for president. You in Prague know that history much better than anyone else, so I won't dwell on it. Only to say that in all of that, this Czech politician with a Swiss passport who spent much of his life in Austria brought, as it were, the spirit and history of Central Europe into the history of the European Union, so that in a sense, when one saw him in some of these gatherings, particularly of the EU. It was as if the spirit of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at its best, had been carried into that of today's European Union. So I'm delighted you're celebrating his life with a lively and I'm sure critical discussion of some of the great subjects of his work, a discussion of Europe today. I'm sorry I can't be with you today myself, but I wish you a fantastic conference in memory of a quite remarkable and great Central European.
We will now turn to someone who probably in some sense knew Karel Schwarzenberg better than any of us, Dr. Barbara Tóth, who's written the biography about him. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm very pleased to present to you today three aspects or three perspectives on Karel Schwarzenberg from an Austrian point of view, of course. The first one would be Schwarzenberg as a mediator, then Schwarzenberg as an Austrian politician, and Schwarzenberg as a media founder. But first, a brief note on my personal relationship with Karel Schwarzenberg. I first met him in person when he unexpectedly attended a book presentation in 2004. I published my first book, which I had researched as part of a Milena Jesenska scholarship at the Institute of the Human Sciences in Vienna. I had investigated the life stories of students from a class that graduated here in Prague in 1989. Reifeprüfung Prague 1989 was the title of this book. And he was there, and that is how we got to know each other. And soon after came the offer to write a biography with him, this one. And this was followed by several interviews and books and many conversations and meetings over the years. What always stood out to me about Karel Schwarzenberg was that he was a European in the best sense of the word. We already heard that. He often said that both the aristocracy and, as he put it, Judaism had thought him in European terms early on, because the virtue of their origins and lifestyles, they were always connected to more than one nation. In other words, bi- or tri-national identities were entirely normal to him. So this brings me to my first perspective on Schwarzenberg, that of the mediator, as I put it. Or you could also call it the interpreter or even the diplomat. Schwarzenberg had the incredible advantage as a Czech politician, especially as the Czech foreign minister from 2007 on, of knowing the Austrian, Czech and German mentalities almost like a native speaker, or rather a native thinker. And this greatly helped him mediate very difficult issues. We already heard about the Czech-German relationship, but there was also the Austrian-Czech relationship at that time, and it was very strained. For instance, the Temelin nuclear power plant debates, as well as the Beneš decrees discussions. Schwarzenberg was able to give interviews in Austrian newspapers to generate understanding for the Czech position, while simultaneously speaking to Czech media to foster understanding for the Austrian viewpoint, all without ever compromising his agenda as Czech foreign minister. There are not many politicians whose identities are so rooted in multiple histories and geographies. One contemporary of Schwarzenberg's who comes to mind, like this, is maybe Daniel Cohn-Bendit or Jean-Claude Juncker. And one can only hope that as Europe continues to grow together and as people with migrant backgrounds enjoy greater opportunities in our countries, this kind of European thinking rooted in supranational identities will become more common in the future. That brings me to my second view, Schwarzenberg as an Austrian politician. When looking at the biography of Karel Schwarzenberg, this aspect may seem rather marginal, yet for him personally, particularly during his 30s and 40s, when Austria was his main place of residence,
It was certainly very important. Schwarzenberg made several attempts to gain a foothold in Austrian domestic politics. He was always a deeply political person and understood it as part of his aristocratic responsibility to engage and to get involved. As long as he was in Vienna, somewhat reluctantly managing the legacy of his ancestors, he was a well-known flaneur in the city's intellectual circles. He was, as Timothy Garton Ash put it, a bohemian in that sense. The break rooms he frequented were the zones freed from bourgeois mediocrity in post-war Vienna. His castle hotel in the Baroque family palace soon became the headquarters of the liberal wing of the Christian Democrats in Austria. However, a political role he always aspired to was denied to him in his adopted homeland because of his background. With that name, never, the grandees of the Conservative People's Party, the ÖVP, Österreichische Volkspartei, told Schwarzenberg. Still, in the 1960s, he belonged to an informal circle of advisors surrounding the then ÖVP leader Josef Klaus. In 1966, the ÖVP, the Conservative Party, won the national elections and was able to appoint the Chancellor. But to Schwarzenberg's great disappointment, he was not given a place in the cabinet. He had to content himself with the role of an informal idea giver. Much later, in the 1990s, exactly 1992, there was another attempt within the Conservative Party to find a political role for Karel Schwarzenberg. At that time, he was briefly considered as a foreign minister or even as a potential presidential candidate for the Green Party. But once again, nothing came out of it, mainly because he was at that time so much engaged here in the Czech Republic. Even prominent conservative figures such as Josef Kreiner or the former Vice-Chancellor Erhard Busek failed in their attempts to bring him into a political office. Above all, the then leader of the Conservatives, called Alois Mock, was suspicious of Schwarzenberg. Busek explained it to me from my book like this. Mock had no understanding for the aristocracy. As the son of a farmer, the history of serfdom probably still resonated with him. So the main reason lies in Austria's very complicated relationship with its past as a monarchy and with the aristocracy more broadly. As you may now know, noble titles are not permitted in Austria. In the 1950s, there was the so-called Habsburg affair, which nearly brought down the Grand Coalition government between the Social Democrats and the People's Party at that time. The Habsburg affair was a politically charged controversy in Austria, centered around the planned return of Otto von Habsburg, the eldest son of the last Austrian Emperor, Karl I. Following the end of monarchy in 1918 and the proclamation of the Austrian Republic, the Habsburg law was passed in 1919. It disempowered the Habsburg family, and they lost the Austrian citizenship, and there was a ban on returning to Austria. So Otto was only allowed to enter Austria in 1966 under the ÖVP single-party government. So in short, a resonant name like Habsburg, Schwarzenberg or Liechtenstein was more of an obstacle than an advantage in post-war Austrian politics. And ironically, it was a social democrat, Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, who gave Schwarzenberg a significant political role by appointing him as the president of the Helsinki Federation, as it was mentioned before. Kreisky did not shy away from the aristocracy. On the contrary, he was fond of it, perhaps due to his own upper middle class Jewish bohemian roots. I have often wondered what might have become of Karel Schwarzenberg had he, like many of his contemporaries in the ÖVP, begun his political career in the 1960s in Austria. Would he have become Austrian foreign minister? Would he have become our federal president? We'll never know, but this illustrates not only one of the paradoxes of Austrian society, but also a certain provincialism. Even though Schwarzenberg never formally held office in Austrian domestic politics, he remained an important voice within it, especially as a conservative critic of the conservative establishment. I believe this is a particularly important role, as criticism from within one's own camp tends to carry more weight than criticism from political opponents. So Schwarzenberg was a sought-after commentator on domestic affairs and always had clear positions, for example, regarding Sebastian Kurz and his reapproachment with the far-right politics of the Freedom Party, FPÖ, first under its leader Jörg Haider and later under his follower Heinz Christian Strache. For example, in an interview on the occasion of Schwarzenberg's birthday with Die Kleine Zeitung, he criticized Austria's veto threat against the accession of Romania and Bulgaria to the Schengen. Austria, he said, is neglecting its historical duty to take care of these countries. Schwarzenberg also criticized the Volkspartei, the Conservative Party, and Sebastian Kurz. Quote, "We are paying the high price for Sebastian. The entire party has fallen under his sway, a swindler. He was wrong from the start. What he said and what he did was a contradiction. Just think of the migration policy." So while Schwarzenberg may not have been a formal participant in Austria's domestic politics, he certainly remained a significant and respected voice in it. And that brings me to the third and last perspective of him, which I think is very important since I'm a journalist myself, Karel Schwarzenberg as a media founder. Karel Schwarzenberg once said that if he had been free to choose any profession, he would love to become a journalist. He was always fascinated by language and the joy of crafting precise and expressive formulations. If I may add a personal remark, in our language, in the German language, Schwarzenberg lives on through his many beaux mots, his vivid imagery and frequent quotations. So you can find a lot of quotes from Schwarzenberg in the press archives, something I find very beautiful and which I believe he would have appreciated himself a lot. So Schwarzenberg always saw himself as someone who wanted to be active in shaping society, and in the 1970s in Austria, behind the scenes, but in a very crucial role, he helped ensure that a form of journalism inspired by American investigative traditions could finally take root in Austria. A brief digression here, Austria's media landscape after the Second World War was dominated by party-affiliated newspapers or by publishing houses clearly aligned with specific political interest groups. Well into the late 1960s, a culture of polite yard or court reporting prevailed, and critical investigative journalism remained a very small phenomenon. That began to change when Oskar Bronner, an Austrian journalist, he was born in Haifa as the son of the, in Austria, very famous musician Gerhard Bronner, who had fled from the Nazis. When Oskar Bronner returned from abroad with the ambition to found something similar to the New York Magazine in Austria. What Bronner then created still exists today, the magazine's Trend and especially Profil. What is less known or less well known is that Karel Schwarzenberg was a major supporter of these ventures. He provided substantial financial backing, most notably through bank guarantees, that made it possible for these projects to get off the ground in 1970 and 1971. So his wealth helped fund the establishment of these countries' first modern magazine publishing houses. You all know that in the Czech Republic, Schwarzenberg financed and owned Respect, from 1996 on. Kind of the same spirit and similar mission like Profil in Austria. And the underlying idea was always the same: critical journalism and functioning counter-public are essential for a healthy democracy and an open society. This was a deeply held conviction of Karel Schwarzenberg, one he supported not only in words, as many people do, but as he could do with significant financial resources. So let me come to my conclusion. What do these three perspectives tell us not only about Schwarzenberg's life, but about his legacy and about the future of democracy in Europe's troubled world, as the title of this conference asks? First, we need more European-minded politicians in Europe. Second, we need strong conservative parties and party leaders that do not fall in love with right-wing populism or the extreme right. And third, we need the free press to maintain our democracies and our open society in Europe. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, thank you very much indeed. We had a bit of Q&A or non-Q&A earlier on. And I think we have a short break now for about 15 minutes to collect a drink, and then please come back in here and we'll have the further three speakers who are waiting very patiently over there, and they will join us. So, yes, Vice-Rector.
I'd like to add that we have the intervention of the Karel Schwarzenberg's daughter
at the beginning.
At
15:45.
At 15:45. So if you can come back at 15:45, that would be greatly appreciated. 10 minutes.
So thank you very much for getting online. I know that it was really last minute that we have asked you even today if you can join online, and it's a great pleasure because can I introduce you? You are the daughter of Mr. Schwarzenberg, Lela Morgan Schwarzenberg. Welcome, and we are really pleased that you got online with us. And if you can share some words about your father, it will be a great pleasure for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say how sorry I am that I can't be there in person, or that any of my children can't be there in person. And I can assure you, if you ever plan to do such an event again in the future, we will make every effort possible to be there. Because I would have loved to experience firsthand his intellectual and political legacy to be discussed and therefore kept alive. And I looked at the list of speakers, and it's an incredible honor. And I know this event would have made him very, very happy. I have a son who has just written his dissertation for his bachelor degree on the Prague Spring, and he has read books of almost all the speakers present, and so that would have meant even this would have meant a lot to my children as well. Anyway, what to say? I mean, you've all have heard of my father. My father had many passions, but on the top of the list were always Europe, democracy, of course, his homeland, the Czech Republic, but then, also kind of young people. He was always looking for, to speak to them, to have contact with them. So I know how much that would have meant to him. And I'm sure he is there in spirit, in some shape or form, all the way through to the beers who you will undoubtedly drink at the end of such a long day. So anyway, best of luck. I will join in, and it makes us, it makes my family very happy that you started that event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Schwarzenberg. I think that we are really very lucky to have you online like that, and we wish you good luck as well, and we are really thankful for your words, nice words. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Petra.
Let me introduce the first speaker of our second section, Mrs. Petra Guasti from the Faculty of Social Sciences, and the title of her paper is Between Polarization and Democracy, the Legacy of Karel Schwarzenberg in the Age of Autocratization.
Good afternoon, everybody. So in my speech, I formed the speech in 3 acts. The story of self, about democratic legacy of Karel Schwarzenberg, story of us on polarization, democratic crisis and decency, and the story of now on democratic renewal. Dear colleagues, there are few figures in post-1989 Central Europe who stood up so unwaveringly in service of democracy, decency and responsibility as Karel Schwarzenberg. His life was shaped by exile, resistance, diplomacy and principled politics. He knew what it meant to live without freedom, and so he made defending it the moral center of his public life. Schwarzenberg believed democracy must be lived, not merely legislated. Citizenship begins not with laws, but with attitude, with civility, with the refusal to scapegoat, with the willingness to defend the rights of those we disagree with. He stood up for the unpopular, voted for the principled, and listened especially to the young, long before they had any power. For him, Europe was not a bureaucracy, it was a civilizational promise. Dignity, rights, and peace would not again be sacrificed to expediency, nationalism, or imperialism. He once said, "Democracy is about debate, even fierce debate, but it must never become a witch hunt." This insistence on political responsibility, on democratic ethics, was the essence of his public philosophy. Not performative piety, but daily decency, not tribalism, but principled disagreement. This is the legacy that we are now called to defend in Prague, in Kiev, in Washington. Polarization and democratic crisis. Democracy is a way of life. It involves a willingness to compromise and respect for differing opinions. Karel Schwarzenberg said at the Forum 2000 in 2014. Today, we are not simply witnessing a crisis of politics. We are experiencing a profound crisis of democratic coexistence. Over the past 2 decades of the populist zeitgeist, we have seen political boundaries harden into moral absolutes and trust erode between citizens and institutions, between parties and publics, between people themselves. The research of my group clearly indicates that the contemporary polarization is no longer primarily ideological. It has become affective, emotional, and deeply intransigent. Citizens increasingly regard opponents not as legitimate rivals, but as threats. Our research confirms that polarization weakens democratic deliberation, turning politics from negotiation into conflict, from dialogue to denunciation. We see it clearly here in Central Europe, and notably in the Czech Republic, where populist rhetoric and parliamentary obstructionism disrupts governance, further undermining faith in democratic institutions. The same polarization, however, also possesses another face. The dramatic events surrounding Russia's aggression in Ukraine show how polarization can mobilize support for democratic values. It reminds us that democracy is never neutral, but requires active defense and principled engagement. Today, the dividing line is not between left and right, but between democratic commitment and authoritarian temptations. Karel Schwarzenberg understood profoundly that how we argue matters just as much as what we argue about. In times of escalating polarization, decency becomes radical. He often reminded us that courage is not noise, courage is restraint, principle, and clarity. Democracy, Schwarzenberg insisted, is not about being right. It's about making room for others to be wrong without being destroyed. This ethical clarity is essential if democracy is to weather the storms of autocratization, populism, and polarization. As we look around us, this courage is too often absent, replaced by anger and fear. Our public debates have become theaters of division rather than platforms for deliberation, consensus, and compromise. So where do we go from here? And I would propose to go towards democratic renewal. All my life, I have fought for freedom and democracy. I have always believed that if you have opportunities in front of you, you also have the responsibility to act on them. That's a quote by Karel Schwarzenberg. Today, we have that responsibility. It begins, as Schwarzenberg showed us, with the courage. This courage demands reinvesting, not just in formal democratic institutions, but in everyday practice of democracy. It calls us to move beyond mere electoral democracy towards genuine participatory democracy, democracy as a lived experience. Across Europe today, we witness a resurgence of democratic innovation designed to bridge divides and renew public trust. Citizens' assemblies in Ireland, France, Germany, participatory budgeting in many cities, including Madrid, Barcelona, but also 137 cities and municipalities around the Czech Republic. And deliberative fora are not abstract exercises and data collection points for scholars of democracy. They are genuine acts of democratic repair. They create spaces for disagreement that do not divide us, but empower us. They do not polarize us further, but offer ways to reconnect. These innovations rebuild trust because they invite people not just to voice opinions, but to share responsibility, to make difficult choices collectively, and to live with the consequences of democratic decisions. Democracy, Schwarzenberg reminds us, must always remain tangible, human, and deeply personal. As we face the age of autocratization and democratic backsliding, let us remember Schwarzenberg's conviction that democracy must never be reduced to institutions alone. It must be embodied, renewed, and defended in every generation. And the final, let me close with this. According to VDEM, as of 2025, there are now 29 liberal democracies around the world. Liberal democracy is no longer the global default. It's a minority regime type, but it's still ours to fight for. The Czech Republic remains one of those 29 liberal democracies. That is not a guarantee, it's a responsibility. Karel Schwarzenberg is no longer with us, but his values are, and so is his example. And so the choice is now ours, whether we treat democracy as a memory or as a mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. If you don't mind, I would suggest to leave the questions after the three papers, because Professor Žantovský needed to go and Professor Garton Ash was just pre-recorded, but I think that Barbara Tóth didn't have the occasion to answer to your questions, so I just suggest to have the question and answers section after the three interventions. So the second speaker will be Professor Jacques Rupnik from Sciences Po and College of Europe, and a former advisor to the Czech President Václav Havel. So the floor is yours.
There's no mic.
Here is the microphone.
Oh, here is the mic, okay. Dobrý den, great pleasure to be here, and I think it's the organizers should be congratulated for arranging an event which other institutions, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, have not yet considered organizing. So I think you are, you deserve great tribute for that. Much has already been said, so that makes my task both easier and more difficult, avoiding the repeat of some of the things. I will briefly say three things, essentially. One is about the politics of values, as understood by Karel Schwarzenberg. Very briefly about Europe, perhaps we can then discuss it more at length in the question and answer period, and then something about Russia and empire, which was our last conversation very shortly before he died. The events of 1989 were often described as a return of democracy, but also as a return of history, somehow the historical reconnection. And I think nobody embodies that better than Karel Schwarzenberg. Really, the two became intertwined. And as I must say, as somebody who was born in this country, but lived in France now for, dare I say, 60 years, successful returns of, and I'm not an exile, a French mother, etc. I'm not in that category. I'm not speaking about, but I'm talking about Czech exiles whom I have known a great deal of. Successful return of exiles is a very rare occasion, very rare, unique, and Karel Schwarzenberg really is successful return of an exile. And that is perhaps the key explanation is not just everything that has been said about what his family represents, but the fact that he had never lost the connection to the country, and that he had considered his return somehow as a part of his own personal identity. He didn't know it would happen. He didn't know. But as he said in a very interesting conversation, it was unpublished, it was meant as a book. It never appeared as a book, but I have a couple of chapters from it. A conversation he had with the writer Jiří Grůša, who was in exile himself. He was a Charter 77 signatory, expelled to Germany. He lived in Germany, and we would meet often at Schwarzenberg Castle in Schweiz. Anyway, he had these conversations with Schwarzenberg where he explored that theme, that relationship of Schwarzenberg to this country. And there is a sentence there that struck me. It says, "My family has been tied to the history of this country for so long that I cannot neglect my duty towards it." This was before 1989. This was mid-80s, let's say. And so there was always the idea that the relationship to his country is something he has inherited, but not just, of course, from his immediate parents, but also from way back. So that is very interesting. And when he talks in that conversation with Grůša about the values of responsibility, duty, service, etc., and he says that these values were instilled in him. He uses a German word, geprägt. It's instilled, but a stronger version of instill, since his childhood. Okay, so this is what you grow up with. And that stayed with him all the way. Now, I know my time is limited, so I must promptly move to the first task, first point, which is the politics of values. I think for Schwarzenberg, coming from his Christian background, obviously, that is the idea of human dignity, then translated by the Enlightenment into human rights. That is how we understood this. And that was another connection to his country, of course, to, as has already been mentioned, to the human rights movement, to Charter 77, to Václav Havel, of course, personally, which created really between the two of them a very unique combination. It has been mentioned, and this is a period when I have no Schwarzenberg in the mid-80s, in Vienna, where we met. I remember our first lunch you know, where in Vienna there's Hotel Schwarzenberg, and there is part of the hotel which is a private residence. He invited me for lunch. We didn't know each other, so it was just the two of us. And he started with a prayer. And of course, testing the French visitor, the Voltairean skeptic. And he established the terms very early on. And we immediately hit it off, because what united us was a concern about what was happening here. And he was involved then with the Helsinki Federation for Human Rights. He was involved. He was a president of it. And that is very interesting, because at that time he clearly established a connection between what I said, his relationship to the country, with an actually existing human rights movement in the country. And that was Charter 77. But of course, as a Helsinki Federation, that meant connection with the human rights movement elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, which meant that he traveled a bit in relation to these issues. And it is interesting, I mean, we are now exactly 50 years after the Helsinki Agreement. I'm going from Prague to Helsinki to a conference about 50 years after. You know, what is a legacy? I mean, we're talking about the legacy of Karel Schwarzenberg. Well, there's also 50 years legacy of the Helsinki Agreement. And the Helsinki Agreement, as you well know, perhaps the students might not necessarily be familiar with it. It was both considered as stabilizing the status quo in Europe, recognition of the post-war status quo, that was the initial meaning, security, the first basket, economic ties, second basket. And there was a third basket concerning human rights, which most people at the time of the signing of the agreement considered as an alibi that the great powers put in to appease sort of the public opinion or something like that. Of course, we know the rest of the story. That third basket gained a momentum of its own, and it's really the Helsinki effect, you can call it that way. Well, it had unintended consequences. It's a history of unintended consequences. And that is where Karel Schwarzenberg role comes in, because, of course, the Helsinki Federation was directly involved with the monitoring of the third basket. There were these review conferences. There was one in Belgrade, one in Madrid, and one in Vienna in the 1980s. So clearly, you had there the review conference in Vienna, Helsinki Federation chaired by Karel Schwarzenberg, and direct connection with the dissident movements in the various countries who are asking for the implementation of that third basket. So that was the connection with Prague. This is as chair of the Helsinki Federation, he went to Prague actually, and this is for the first time when he went with the dissidents, and including Václav Havel. I must not speak for too long on that, but that's where the connection is established. And I fast forward because it has already been described, 1989, his return, and coming, you know, to the castle. This is actually where we would see each other very often. I as a more modest advisor, he as actually the head of the office. And you had this unique combination, you know, Václav Havel, the artist, the bohemian, the human rights fighter, the writer, and Schwarzenberg, how would you call it, Aristodemocrat, who immediately found a team spirit with Václav Havel. And that's how, so that was very strong. That was, I think, symbolically strong. The king of the dissident movement coming to the castle, but also the return of Karel Schwarzenberg. That was a very strong moment. What is it that united them? I would say at least three things, very briefly. One of them is, and I will perhaps return to it if there is time. One is ethics is your entry ticket into politics. This may be a proposition that is today may seem very odd in our period. But for them, at the time, that was part of what 1989 was about. You know, you were not coming to seize power, etc. You were there. Second thing, civil society matters. It is part of the democratic process, and it must be encouraged here, but it must be encouraged across borders throughout Central Europe. And of course, Karel Schwarzenberg, as like myself, were very strongly interested in the situation in the Balkans, the war in the Balkans in the 1990s, you know, where nationalism and the vertical allegiances overrun the horizontal allegiances of civil society. So civil society's second Central European dimension, including Visegrad. And the idea, of course, that the idea of human rights should be part and parcel of your thinking and designing a foreign policy. And that meant that applied, of course, to Havel's approach, of course, but also what Schwarzenberg understood as what Europe also should be bearing in mind in attempting to design a foreign policy. So that shouldn't mean that he was simply interested in the principles, announcing human rights principles, and they should be guiding your foreign policy. That would be a very crude. Those who know Karel Schwarzenberg know that because of his deep knowledge of European history and his sort of matter-of-fact and realistic view of things, his combination of the two, the principles and the realistic approach, it was, I think, a unique contribution. I'll give you just one example of it, if I'm not running out of time. This was at the time of the spring 2003, the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq. And we met in Voldřichová at his place on a Sunday afternoon. The war had just begun, and I'm mentioning an article which was, I forgot in which paper, which was highly critical of the American intervention. You know, wrong, it was lies, it was going to fail, etc., etc. And I said, what do you think? He says, I agree. Okay, I was surprised. And then came the second part. However, he would still understand, not condone, support, or think, but understand that for small countries of Central Europe, it is an option to support this or to follow the Americans on this crazy adventure. I mean, he would certainly think it was totally misguided, because it was understood as an insurance policy for their own security. There is no other security umbrella available. You are planning to join the European Union, but that is not your security umbrella. You don't know what the future will be like, and therefore you want to consolidate the transatlantic bond as your own security insurance policy. So there was no illusion or delusion about building democracy in the Mesopotamian desert. He was not that kind of, the people who are saying this is democracy, recasting the Middle East democracy. No, he didn't buy any of that. He said, no, I agree with the article which says this is baloney. However, you can make a sort of realist case that for the countries that are totally dependent on a security umbrella provided by a US guarantee, you can make a realistic case for it, okay? This is not a very noble argument, but so that is just to illustrate. You can have an idealist view that human rights should be part of your foreign policy. You may also understand that there are other considerations. I'm running out of time. I would say one word about Europe. Given what you've heard about his biography, I don't have to stress the fact that for Karel Schwarzenberg, Europe was not, first of all, the institutions, its modus operandi, EU, etc. No, EU was, to use the phrase from the founding fathers of the American Constitution, this is a self-evident truth, as I say. All men are created equal, and this is a self-evident truth. Well, for Schwarzenberg, Europe was a self-evident truth because of what has been said about his family, his aristocratic family, connected to the aristocratic families and the royal families throughout Europe. If you are brought up, geprägt, as he used the German term, with this in you, that this is, it's a self-evident truth that you are a European. This is not this is not a great philosophical question. It is there. It's something you've inherited. Of course, then it is a question how you translate this into current European politics and the politics of the European Union, and that obviously is. If I had to summarize, his view would be. The EU can succeed, must succeed, but it can succeed only if it is aware and, conscious and actively cultivating the idea that it is an inheritor of a culture, of a civilization, and that the values that we proclaim, when we proclaim we defend the rule of law, we defend principles of human rights, we know where it's coming from. And that Europeanness, that, as I say, was part of what he was, that is what he thought must be kept connected to the European, not just a bunch of legal principles that a European court upholds. It is something deeper. I would say that would be the last word. The third point is about empire. Our last conversation was in September 23, but a couple of weeks before he died. And we went there with Karel Schwarzenberg and Petra. And after lunch, we had a great time. And after lunch, Karel Schwarzenberg, a journalist, always ready, put up his recorder. And we had a discussion that he recorded and then published in a paper. I will not inflict on you the whole thing, but I would say this so we are talking about Ukraine, Russia, and this is what he had to say. Our main conversation was on the subject of post-89 developments in ex-USSR. That was my argument. Russia was unable to define an identity as a Russian state without the imperial legacy. That, decolonization was painful for France, but France without Algeria was France. Britain without India was Britain. But Russia without an empire, they never figure out what it's supposed to be. And Schwarzenberg in that discussion uses Havel's phrase, Russia has no borders, because it makes no distinction between the nation state and an empire. And the invasion of Ukraine, he says, is an attempt to retain the imperial status. I can even read a short excerpt from it. He says, to be honest, I no longer understand Russia. Okay, that was his way of saying, now I will tell you what it is, or what it is. But he speaks about the consequences of it for Russia. He says, what Putin did is madness. Making Russia dependent on China can only be a losing proposition for Russia. The main winner of this war will be China, as it will acquire a great influence over Russia. And he continues in the same vein. Russia cannot come to terms, it is no longer a great power, etc., etc. Russia is on a losing streak, he says. Finland and Sweden, formerly neutral, have joined NATO. Europe has united in sanctioning Russia's invasion, and Ukraine is putting up a fight and thus acquiring a national identity. I mean, the war as a kind of phase in Ukrainian nation building, which I think is an interesting insight. And I'll conclude with the following. When we were discussing empire, I told him, do you think that the EU represents for the countries of Central Europe a kind of substitute for an empire? What was Habsburg Empire for? It helped to neutralize nationalist tensions between the small nations composing the empire. It was one purpose. And second, it balanced the relationship between the small nations of East Central Europe and Germany and Prussia. That was the purpose of the Habsburg Empire. And I said, well, in a way, doesn't the EU perform a similar role for Central Europe today? It neutralizes the nationalist frictions potentially, and it has created a new, more balanced relationship with Germany. And so, yeah, I said, you know, is it a substitute for an empire? So he smiled and he said, no, this is I will not, he knew what I was getting at, but he didn't want to engage into some kind of long discussion about the past and the relevance of that past, because he was interested in today, in the reconfiguration of Europe, and not in the politics of imperial nostalgia. As he said, there's plenty of that around nowadays. Nothing I should add to it. Thank you for your attention.
Last but not least, we have a speaker from the Department of Political Science, the Faculty of Social Sciences, Dr. Jakub Franěk. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So I have entitled my presentation "A Conservative Revolutionary on Karel Schwarzenberg's Ambiguous Political Legacy." When Karel Schwarzenberg became Czech foreign minister for the first time in 2007, I was actually living in the United States, in Boston. But I shared the news shortly after his appointment about this fact with one of my American friends who happened to know about Schwarzenberg and actually know him a little bit because he had previously lived in Prague and then Vienna. And Chuck's, as my friend's name, reaction was that he just broke out laughing because he found the idea of a, as he put it, German or Austrian prince becoming a Czech foreign minister for a Green Party as extremely hilarious, as something completely absurd. And I tried to explain to him that Schwarzenberg was actually born and raised up in Czechoslovakia, that he was a great Czech patriot, that he was fluent in both Czech and German from his early childhood, etc. Nonetheless, my American friend insisted that Schwarzenberg's family name, as well as his aristocratic titles, clearly betray that he cannot be Czech. And he also believed that many Czechs would not recognize him as such. Well, our debate then evolved into a discussion of the history of nationalism and various types of nationalism, which is something I may return to later on. But thinking about this story in retrospect, I have to recognize that Karel Schwarzenberg's political life was really full of paradoxes, and that his political legacy is likewise paradoxical, and in a certain sense also ambiguous. As a nobleman, a devout Catholic, and a self-professed conservative, Schwarzenberg, as we already heard earlier, was for many years an active member of the Austrian People's Party. Nevertheless, he received his first political appointment from a social democratic chancellor, Bruno Kreisky, who nominated him to the position of the Helsinki Federation for Human Rights. And sorry for repeating what was already said. And this, among other things, gave him an opportunity to travel back to Czechoslovakia and to meet with the local pro-democratic opposition. But his golden hour, if I may put it this way, came a bit later during the 1989 revolution, when he became one of the close advisors of Václav Havel, and later also his chief of staff. And since then he remained a fixture of Czech politics, having served as a senator, a member of parliament, a foreign minister, as well as a co-founder and leader of one of Czech political parties. And today Karel Schwarzenberg is rightly remembered as one of the leading and iconic figures of the 1989 revolution and of the Czech Republic's transition to democracy. And indeed, after Havel's death in 2011, Schwarzenberg came to be perceived as a sort of embodiment of the continuation of the ethos of Havel's principled politics, focused on the protection of democracy and human rights. Given his aristocratic background and conservative convictions, this may again sound somewhat surprising or even paradoxical. But on the other hand, one should remember that conservatism is not necessarily opposed to all changes, and that under certain conditions, conservatives may support even political revolutions. I'm thinking here about Edmund Burke and his support of both American Revolution as well as his interpretation of the English Glorious Revolution of 1688. And at the same time, I think we should recall that the 1989 democratic revolutions in East Central Europe were, in a certain sense, conservative in their spirit. They are remarkably free of any utopian visions of a better future world, which is quite understandable because the communist regime that they ousted was based on one of such visions. And the main aim of these revolutions was indeed nothing more than a return to normalcy, in the sense of the return to normal, in the sense of Western democratic politics and re-establishments of the institutions of representative democracy and rule of law. In Czechoslovakia, at least, the goals of the revolution came to be articulated also in terms of the return to Europe as its natural home, from which the country was, if we use Kunter's expression, kidnapped by the Cold War developments, or as a return to the democratic traditions of Masaryk's first Czechoslovak Republic. In a certain sense, this narrative reminds us of Burke's interpretation of the Glorious Revolution as a restoration of English ancient constitution. Now, Burke was obviously aware that the 1688 revolution accomplished much more than just a return to the status quo ante, since it radically increased the powers of the parliament and therefore the representative nature of English government. Nonetheless, he preferred to frame the Glorious Revolution as restoration of ancient constitution, so to speak, for polemical reasons, namely to reject the parallel that was drawn between the French and the Glorious Revolution by Richard Price. In contrast to the illegitimate French Revolution, which was based on such abstract principles as rights of man or popular sovereignty, the legitimate Glorious Revolution was allegedly based on very concrete and specific legal principles of the ancient constitution, which it aimed to restore. One could argue, if I may speculate, that the men of 1989 Velvet Revolution also preferred to frame their efforts as a restoration of the previous democratic tradition or return to the tried and proven principles of representative democracy, as opposed to the irresponsible experiments with social engineering in order to differentiate between their legitimate enterprise from the illegitimate and in its consequences disastrous communist revolution that occurred some 4 decades earlier. But at the same time, they must have been aware that the enterprise they were engaged in was actually quite daunting and unprecedented, since it entailed both political and economic transformation. I don't want to be pushing this parallel too far, but the main point I wanted to make here is that first, the 1989 Velvet Revolution can be plausibly described as conservative revolution, and second, that this seemingly paradoxical designation is not unprecedented due to certain similarities with Burke's interpretation of the 1688 Glorious Revolution as restoration of the ancient constitution. And I hope that I'm not running out of time, but in the following remarks, I'd like to focus more closely on Schwarzenberg's political legacy. And I shall argue that his style of politics can be indeed described as a sort of Burkean reformist, or even, if you allow me this paradoxical designation, liberal conservatism. This is also the reason why he came to be recognized as one of the iconic figures of the 1989 conservative revolution, as a sort of embodiment of its spirit. Now, what I mean when I say that Karel Schwarzenberg can be described as essentially Burkean, progressive, or liberal conservative, I mean that it's because he often held very liberal or progressive stances on various political issues, but at the same time he used to defend these views by appealing to specific political experience, common sense, or decency, rather than to some abstract principles like human rights. Indeed, one can say that he was predisposed to become such a progressive conservative by his personal history, his experience with Austrian politics, as well as his very good grasp of both Czech and European history. For these reasons, he also came to personify the conservative spirit of the Velvet Revolution better than either the president he served as chancellor or his successor. In contrast to Václav Klaus, Schwarzenberg was very much aware that the intentions of capitalism and democracy are not necessarily aligned, and was often deeply critical of his, as to say, Klaus's neoliberal fundamentalism, as was after all Václav Havel. Nevertheless, Schwarzenberg did not always agree with Havel either. Specifically, he was unamused by Havel's idealization of anti-politics and his distrust of political parties, because Karel Schwarzenberg recognized the importance of political parties and their competition in modern representative democracy. How much time do I have? Okay.
A few minutes.
Schwarzenberg's politics was also remarkably realistic and free of any kind of ideological dogmatism. But this is not to say that he would have been entirely pragmatic or unprincipled. I can recall at least 2 instances where he made principled and at the same time very unpopular stances in Czech politics. During the 2015 refugee crisis, he was one of the very few Czech politicians, and if I'm correct, the only one from the conservative side of the spectrum, who spoke on behalf of the acceptance of refugees by the Czech Republic. And in 2020, he surprised many of his fellow travellers when, together with the then current foreign minister and one of his predecessors, also both of them were social democrats, co-authored an op-ed that was very critical of Israel's government's plans to annex the Jewish settlements in Gaza. In both cases, he dared to speak his convictions even when it meant opposing his political allies, as well as the majority of his own electorate. Nevertheless, one quality that makes Schwarzenberg a true Burkean conservative is what I would call his ability to connect the past with the future. And by this phrase, I do not mean simply to maintain traditions, because after all, only some traditions are worth to be maintained. Rather, I mean the ability to distinguish between the traditions that are worth maintaining from those that are not. Or better, the ability to find historical inspiration for the solution of present problems. And at this point, I would like to return to the beginning of my remarks to the question of Schwarzenberg's allegiance to the Czech nation. I should note that this allegiance was questioned or doubted not only by my American friend, but also by Schwarzenberg's political opponents, including Miloš Zeman during the 2013 presidential election. It is true that Karel Schwarzenberg identified as a Central European. And this is only natural because his family owns estates in Bohemia, Austria, as well as Bavaria, and Schwarzenberg professed that he felt at home in all three of these lands. Nevertheless, he always acted as a true Czech patriot. Actually, questioning the allegiance to the Czech nation must have felt particularly insulting to Karel Schwarzenberg because his family's history. As we already heard from Mr. Žantovský, who's no longer here, in September 1939, his father co-authored the Declaration of Czech Nobility, which pledged its allegiance to the Czech nation. And the significance of the document was actually far more than only symbolic, because it entailed renouncing claims of Germans' Reich citizenship. The declaration was actually written in a very archaic language, which invoked the estate's loyalty to the king and the country. We can also say that it relied on a conception of political nation which predates the modern, that is to say, 19th century ethno-linguistic nationalism. And I'm going to speculate a little bit here. I believe that Karel Schwarzenberg never quite accepted the ethno-linguistic nationalism typical for Central Europe because he was deeply aware of its shortcomings and tragic consequences. And while his family and he himself were loyal to the Czech state, Karel Schwarzenberg was also aware of the tragedy of the principal fruit of the 19th century nationalism, of the breaking up of the Habsburg Empire, which led only to the emergence of a bunch of new nation-states, which, however, in fact, were just as multi-ethnic and ridden with nationalistic struggles as the empire they replaced. I guess that Karel Schwarzenberg realized that the old conception of political nation, which was invoked in the declaration co-authored by his father, was in fact closer to the West European conception of nationalism, which defines nation by a shared history, allegiance to the state, rather than by ethnicity or language. And he also probably would agree that this type of political nationalism as patriotism is more fitting for the 21st century than the ethno-linguistic nationalism typical for this part of Europe. I can also imagine that he recognized the project of European integration, which he strongly supported, as a project that provides the continent with the chance of overcoming the national divisions that resulted from the 19th century nationalism. Karel Schwarzenberg's legacy testifies that you can be both a loyal Czech patriot and a European committed to the project of European integration, just as it testifies that a liberal conservative is not an oxymoron. In this sense, he remains an object of our admiration and hopefully emulation. 3-4 minutes? Or no? Okay, I'm going to end it here. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So now the moment has come to ask some questions. If I may ask Barbara to come join us on the stage, because in order to give you the opportunity to ask questions to all the speakers from the two sections. So, if I may, I have a question maybe for the three of you or the four of you. In the conclusion, being an aristocrat, is it an advantage or a disadvantage? Because we have I remember this interview given by Karel Schwarzenberg, and the question was, what kind of citizen are you? Are you a half Czech and half Austrian? And the answer was, no, I am an entire Czech and an entire Austrian. So do you think that partly it could seem a little bit archaic or out of time to be an aristocrat nowadays, but there is this advantage of having the family of all around Europe and to to consider Europe as self-evident truth, as you mentioned. So finally, what do you think about this idea? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage being an aristocrat in politics?
Barbara.
So thank you for the question. I have never been an aristocrat in politics.
Neither.
So I cannot speak from a personal experience. We don't choose where we are born, but I think that for me the profound matter there is that if you, and that is what our region has always been about, what it is for me, that and especially if you go and live abroad for a long time and you try to integrate but you don't want to assimilate, we keep asking this question. Masaryk asked this question, and I think we all ask it in our heads, and the answer, I think, the most constructive and productive one is to see identity not as a zero-sum game, as populists do when they divide us between us versus them along ethnic lines or economic lines, but see identity as a positive sum, that we can be more things, that I can feel, of course, most at home here, and here also in this room, because being an academic is also part of who we are, like I assume is probably being in Shandong for a noble man. There also is like his habitat, I guess, or the palaces are the habitat. And but we also can feel at home elsewhere, and Europe is also our home. And I think that this is the counter poison to this exclusionary rhetoric of populism.
Yeah,
the question is it an advantage to be an aristocrat? Well, first I would say, of course it is, from a power, technical, strategic point of view, because you have a great network when you're an aristocrat. You have informal power. You have the manners. So Schwarzenberg had that, and he always said it's a huge privilege to be aristocrat. And he always said, and I have to give something back because of that. So he thought it's his responsibility to pay the society back for something we just inherited, because it's just a chance. By chance he became aristocrat. And he also said it's very sad that among his younger family members or people of noble heritage, he cannot find anymore this responsibility to give something back to society that they inherited. So I'd say it's it has two sides, as everything in life has two sides.
I don't know.
Well, on this, I think that there are two elements. One is something that was common to aristocracy in the Habsburg Empire in the 19th century, was something called the land patriotism, something that you are connected to an area. You have your estates, let's say in Bohemia, and that was a famous phrase of Graf Thun, I'm neither Czech nor German, I'm a Bohemian. Ich bin ein Böhmen. I'm a Bohemian. Okay, so this is an attachment. So you have that element, and that is there in the Schwarzenberg family. And then comes the confrontation of those ideas with the creation of Czechoslovakia, which is built on a new nation-state principles associated with democracy, etc., etc. And you may think the aristocracy may feel very ambivalent about that, and comes a crisis. And it is in a crisis moment where you have to make the choice and you have to say who you are. And it is in that crisis, I mean, you have quoted it, Michal Žantovský also quoted it, that moment in 1939 when you're confronted, are you a German? Are you going to be, part of the Nazi Reich and therefore preserve your properties, etc.? I said, no, we are standing with Czechoslovakia. So this is it, you come with a land patriotism and then eventually a crisis forces you to choose.
I have already asked. So, do you have any questions, remarks? It's a great occasion to have all the speakers here, so maybe. Yeah.
I've met too many things already. Don't you think society is rather failing when you get confronted with the choice that you just mentioned? I mean, of course, just occasionally conflict arises of a very particular kind, and you either, at the end of the day, you're either, you know, with the colonels or against the colonels, whatever it happens to be. But shouldn't we, 90%, 99% of the time in society, be trying to avoid these situations? We want people like Schwarzenberg being across the boundaries. We want people to be all kinds of things. You know, I'm Cornish, English, European, a windsurfer, an academic. I'm happy with all of those identities. And I want to talk to people. And I think that the more that, I mean, the polarization that's going on at the moment is forcing everybody to decide, are you with us or against us? It's the wrong question. It's not, are you with us or against us? What do you think? Different question.
Thank you very much for all the interesting talks and sharing with us your time which you had with Karel Schwarzenberg. I would like to ask one question, and whether you can have an answer about did Karel Schwarzenberg had an idea how would Russia end up? I mean, Jacques Rupnik, you mentioned that he said that after this conflict China would be the winner. But what would happen with Russia in future?
Well, should I answer right now? We actually did discuss that during our conversation. I forgot now whether it features in the published version of it, and I think it probably does, because that was an interesting part. Because one of the questions is, can Russia ever become a democracy? And i.e. most of us around the table were rather skeptical given the historical record. But Schwarzenberg said, well, it shouldn't be excluded, but it can happen on one, and then of course so you say, okay, he will, and then he says, it can happen on one condition, that Russia will be defeated in this war. That just like in Germany after 1945, Germany, democracy was, so to speak, imposed by the defeat from outside, and it has successfully developed after that. And he says, somehow Russia would need a confrontation with a defeat of that type, which would be a defeat of the imperial idea and a defeat of the regime that was propelling it. So that was, and of course then our conversation went off in, you know, can Putin be brought to the International War Crimes Tribunal? Well, then he said the same thing. No chance whatsoever, except if Russia were to be defeated. And then he added, this is highly unlikely. It may be stopped in its war of conquest, and this is what we're witnessing under our very eyes, maybe some kind of territorial debate, but defeated in that sense, not really. So he was rather skeptical about the possibility. Yeah, the parallel with Germany, I think, was on his mind. He was also interesting about Ukraine, that it is somehow the war that brings about, consolidates the Ukrainian identity, which is an interesting, you know, since we are in an academic surroundings, but you know, Charles Tilly's ideas, nations make wars, wars make nations. And this is exactly what we are witnessing in Ukraine. This was a very diverse nation. You look at surveys, sociological surveys from the 90s, it's really very diverse, hence the case for decentralization. Even people, great supporters of Ukraine, independence, like Zbigniew Brzezinski was saying, you have to federalize the country, or highly decentralize, because it's so diverse. The war is part of a process of what we call nation-state building, nation building. Well, state, we will see what kind of state it is.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful speech. And I have a question. Just now, the professor mentioned that China is the biggest beneficiary of the Russian-Ukraine war. I would like to ask how this conclusion was made during the dialogue, during the conversation, and what kind of impact will have on the future relationship between the China and the whole Europe, the democracy Europe, and what is your outlook on the democratic perspective of China and Taiwan, and will the China's ties with the Europe be weakened or be strengthened? Thank you so much.
Well, you've outlined the subject of the next conference, and it will be a 2-day conference. One afternoon will not be enough. I will just give you one snippet of what actually is connected with Schwarzenberg's idea. What did he mean that China is the victor of this war? Is that Russia, to be a really modern power, should not be thinking in terms of territory, how much territory Europe has. It's a territory, I think I mentioned it in my quote, territory is no longer the prime issue. And the only way to modernize Russia is in some kind of partnership with Europe. This is where the new ideas, the technology, the interaction, this is what can, in the long run, be a modernizing project for Russia. By doing what Putin did, creating a war which actually creates a new Cold War, separates Europe from Russia, he has made Russia subservient to China. You know, can you say to a Russian nationalist that it is in their interest to become a vassal of China? Wow, this is quite a proposition, you know. So this is what Schwarzenberg meant. Russia is making a choice that makes its modernization impossible through Europe. It creates dependency on China, and the only beneficiary of all that will be, there's a slaughter in Europe. Europe will be badly clobbered by all that, but China will emerge from it with a series of advantages. So that was Schwarzenberg's argument. All your other questions I leave to others, or to the conference you will be organizing.
Okay.
If I may, I will take the aspect on China and democratization. That's something we are discussing in comparative democratization. For a long time, people believe that China will, after opening, after becoming part of after trading globally, that the development will kind of follow the established model, that you establish a middle class, the middle class will acquire material property, and therefore will then require rights and freedoms, and that's how it's going to be. And I think for at least since the ascent of President Xi to power, we have seen that that is definitely not going to be the case. On the contrary, the regime has reacted to the series of economic crises with internal hardening. It has learned a lot from 1989 on what not to do, or how these regimes in Central and Eastern Europe have fallen, and it's trying to avoid getting into the same issues. So I would say no. That doesn't mean that China is not experimenting with participatory involvement, but it's not. These are innovations. These are governance innovations, but they are not democratic innovations, because you cannot have democratic innovations in a consolidated authoritarian regime. And whether or not China is going to be exporting its form of autocracy, I'm not a proponent. I'm not a proponent of that. China is basically the proposition of China, which was to kind of compete with the United States in Africa and other developing countries, was we don't attach strings. Western countries attach strings. They want rule of law. They want not jailing of political prisoners, free media, etc. China doesn't rule of law. China doesn't ask for any of that. So it's not going. It's going to have, let's say, neutral in this way effect on these countries.
Can I react to you? So you said that Russia's path to modernization is through some sort of partnership or cooperation with Europe, but looking at it from the other side, from the Russian perspective, couldn't they see partnership with China as an alternative path to modernization, which exactly would not require them to change their political system?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to speculate about what. I think basically Russia provides to China oil and gas. China provides support for its wars, provides probably military equipment and intelligence or what have you. Is this a path to modernization of Russia? I have great doubts. But it's an old debate that the Russians are having. I mean, you look at the 19th century, the big debate was, the Westernizers, those who thought that Russia should be following the path of Western Europe, and that was true for the Social Democrats. It was true for liberals like Struve. And they thought, therefore, there was a time lag. Russia had to catch up, and then it will be either ready for socialism, if you were a social democrat, or ready for a liberal democracy, if you were somebody like Struve. And then there were the others who said, no, Russia should not be connecting with Europe and the West and imitating. It should be following its own path, the Eurasian path. And this is the ideology that is being revived today, and it has an ideological content that I can see. Whether it has a modernizing content, then I have great doubts. But I don't know about
I don't know about Russia, but I was a couple of years ago. I visited Georgia, and they are undergoing a massive construction of new highways, railways, etc., etc. And all this stuff is being built by Chinese companies.
Yeah. Well, so the new Trans-Siberian will be built by Chinese. Is this good for Russia? I don't know. It's certainly good for Chinese. That is certainly.
I think we have been drawn quite far away.
Moving away from Schwarzenberg.
Our original subject. Yeah. So, if there are no other questions, we have some small presents for the speakers, and I would like to thank you all for participating in this conference. And I think it's not the very last one, because we already agreed with Mr. Žantovský that it would be great to organize something in the beginning of December, on the occasion of the anniversary of Karel Schwarzenberg, but we will keep you posted about the follow-up conference, maybe.
Excellent. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and thank you all the people who came to the public. It's always pleasant to